Picture this. You're standing beneath the vaulted arches of the Tsarskoye Selo Theater in the waning light of an autumn afternoon, the air sharp with the scent of birch smoke and distant snow. The velvet curtains have long since faded. The painted ceiling still shimmers faintly with gold leaf and the divine gaze of Apollo. Tourists whisper through the aisles now, marveling at the chandeliers and imperial ornament. But what they don't see, and were never meant to, is the corridor behind the stage, the one that led to the hidden mezzanine. There, behind locked doors, an invisible performance once unfolded, ritualized, cultivated, and cruel. If these kinds of stories move you, if you find meaning in the truths history tries to forget, consider sharing this one and let us know where in the world you're listening from. The shadows of power are long, and sometimes they fall on the smallest bodies. What follows is not a story about Catherine the Great's reforms or her enlightened correspondence with French philosophers. It is not about palaces or battles or treaties. It is about children, about a hidden world behind brocade and etiquette, where orphans, unwanted by the world and invisible by design, were molded into vessels of imperial delight. By the time Catherine ascended the Russian throne in the year 1762, she had already survived a coup, a loveless marriage, and the silencing of her critics. She was a woman who had learned early that appearance was everything. She believed in order, control, and the power of beauty to enforce both. Under her rule, Russia entered what historians call its golden age of culture. The court was filled with foreign tutors, French architects, Italian painters. But among the most ambitious of her projects was the creation of an imperial theater unlike any in Europe. A stage not just for art, but for absolute control disguised as aesthetics. The theater at Tsarskoye Selo was not just a performance hall. It was a palace within a palace, built to house a troupe of carefully cultivated performers trained from childhood to mimic grace, virtue, and eroticism. According to documents preserved in the Russian State Archive of Literature and Art, Catherine's court commissioned the expansion of the orphanage network near St. Petersburg in the early 1760s, not only for charitable appearance, but to provide raw material for this new cultural machinery. From these orphanages came the children, mostly girls, but not exclusively, taken between the ages of 7 and 10. They were chosen for beauty, obedience, and the absence of family ties. According to imperial records, they were given new names upon arrival, baptized into court life as blank slates. Their old identities were filed and buried in bureaucratic layers too dense to ever be retrieved. In the words of historian Dr. Elena Durasova, these children were not educated. They were curated. At the center of this silent mechanism stood Count Alexei Orlov, the architect of Catherine's coup and her most loyal instrument. Orlov oversaw the acquisition of children and ensured their readiness before introduction to the court. His role was neither artistic nor symbolic. He managed compliance. His correspondence with Catherine, largely preserved but censored, refers to the children as theatrical stock and speaks of their conditioning with the same tone used to describe the taming of horses. The daily regimen imposed on the orphans was rigid, almost monastic. They were taught music, dance, and languages, not as tools of empowerment, but as performances to be reproduced on command. They were rarely seen in daylight. Meals were taken in silence. Physical affection was discouraged among peers. Punishments were meted out for imperfection in posture, tone, or expression. At the edge of this machinery stood director Viktor Malinovsky, a failed dramatist turned administrator, who had once dreamed of staging Greek tragedies, but instead became the choreographer of imperial facades. He believed in art as submission. According to his journals, now housed at the Pushkin Museum, he saw the children not as humans, but as malleable vessels capable of embodying divine ideals if all remnants of individuality were burned away. And burn away they did. The transformation of the orphans was not a singular act, but a gradual erasure, masked as refinement. Each child entered the program with a name, a language, a history, however brief or painful. But over time, these were hollowed out and replaced with the expectations of the court. They were assigned identities that fit the roles required by the imperial imagination. The ingenue, the nymph, the tragic muse. A girl who cried too easily might be cast as a perpetual Ophelia. One who smiled with charm but not desire might be sent away for retraining. This was not theater in the public sense. The productions staged at Tsarskoye Selo were rarely open to general audiences. Instead, they were private salons, performances attended by diplomats, favored nobles, and members of the empress's inner circle. The children danced, recited, and performed scenes from court-approved classics. But behind the gilded balconies and velvet drapes, something else unfolded. Something that left no playbill, no published script, only the wordless memories of those forced to live it. Nadia Polyakova was one such memory, an orphan who survived long enough to become an overseer. She had arrived at the palace at age 9, selected for her unusual poise and unblemished features. For years, she played the dutiful page, then the virtuous maiden in sentimental French scenes. But when her voice changed and her body no longer fit the court's taste for fragile adolescence, she was reabsorbed, not cast out, but transformed into an instrument of control. Polyakova's personal notes, discovered decades later in a trunk beneath a collapsed outbuilding at Tsarskoye Selo, detail the emotional contradictions of her role. She described her younger self as both ornament and weapon, compelled to enforce discipline on new arrivals, even as she recalled her own punishments with surgical clarity. She had learned, she wrote, to measure a child's obedience by the stillness of her breathing. Her name appears in dozens of performance rosters as a tutor and assistant director, but never as a person of standing. She was neither servant nor peer. She belonged to no class, no lineage, no future. The performances themselves became increasingly stylized, detached from recognizable narratives. As Catherine aged, the scenes shifted from classical drama to tableaux vivants, living pictures that emphasize stillness, symmetry, and sensual display. The children were posed like paintings, reclining on divans draped in translucent fabric, eyes lowered to avoid the implication of gaze. They held fruit, musical instruments, or gilded props, their bodies arranged not for storytelling, but for pleasure. What made this cruelty so insidious was its language. The court described these shows as elevated art, an aesthetic offering to culture and civilization. Foreign visitors, those permitted to glimpse them, often praised their elegance, comparing the children to angels or sylphs. The dissonance between appearance and reality was so total, so perfectly maintained, that it became almost impossible to question. And yet, there were cracks. In 1774, a letter from a Polish ambassador, Stanisław Czarnecki, described a strange silence behind the stage at a midsummer event. He wrote of children who did not speak unless addressed, of their airless grace and too perfect gestures. He sensed that what he had witnessed was not performance, but endurance. The imperial court, of course, dismissed such observations as the product of unfamiliarity. But those who remained in Russia, who observed the children over years rather than evenings, sometimes noticed what could not be polished away. Girls who blinked too slowly, boys who flinched when praised, a tightening of shoulders at the sound of certain names. Director Malinowski retired in 1781, dying childless and embittered in a dacha filled with broken stage props. His replacement, a former ballet master from Dresden, found the orphan troupe hollowed and compliant, incapable of improvisation. He wrote, "They are perfect shadows, but they do not know how to feel." By the final decade of Catherine's reign, the theater had become both institution and relic, its machinery still functioning, but drained of purpose. The children still arrived, still danced, still recited. But the Empress attended less frequently. Her interests shifted to diplomacy, territorial expansion, and the grooming of political heirs. The private salons that had once drawn ministers and foreign dignitaries now echoed half-empty. The once rapt audiences replaced by minor nobles and ambitious bureaucrats eager to flatter a fading tradition. And yet, the children remained. Their presence was no longer about cultural prestige. It had become something else, something darker, more ritualistic. A performance sustained not for admiration, but for the maintenance of control. The theater existed now as a symbol, a quiet reminder of the Empress's reach into every corner of her empire, including the bodies and voices of those no one else had claimed. The system persisted in large part due to habit, and because no one person bore full responsibility. Catherine's attentions had turned elsewhere, but her silence signaled approval. Count Orlov had withdrawn from court life, but his protégés continued the selection process. Nadia Polyakova remained in her role, her instructions never questioned. She had by then developed a complex system of behavioral assessment, categorizing children not by aptitude, but by pliability. Those who resisted were redirected, a euphemism for confinement, punishment, or disappearance. Those who conformed too quickly were often pushed further, used for the more private entertainments that were never recorded. Polyakova's notes from this period grow increasingly disjointed. One entry describes a boy named Lev, taken at age 10, who could mimic weeping on command. Another tells of a girl, Katya, whose hair had to be cut and regrown 3 times because a visiting duchess found her too reminiscent of a dead niece. These children had become vessels for griefs and desires that had nothing to do with them. They were punished for resemblance, rewarded for absence of self. It is during this phase that some of the worst degradations are believed to have occurred. Though official records remain sanitized, later testimonies from court servants suggest that children were sometimes lent to favored guests under the guise of artistic rehearsal. What happened in those hours left no physical record, but in private. Correspondence one chambermaid wrote of waking to find a child curled in the storage hall, shaking, his costume torn at the hem. She was dismissed the following day. Historians have long struggled to frame this chapter. Catherine remains a revered figure, an icon of enlightened monarchy, reform, and expansion. But within the private architecture of her rule existed an entire structure devoted not to education or care, but to beautified captivity. And at its core stood figures like Orlov, Malinovsky, and Polyakova. Not monsters, but executors of policy disguised as art. They did not believe themselves cruel. That is what makes them so dangerous. According to Dr. Anya Volodina, who has spent over 20 years researching the court's theatrical archives, the greatest violence inflicted on the orphans was not physical, but ontological. They were made to perform lives that were not theirs, she writes, until they forgot they had any other. Their gestures became their language. Their roles became their identities. And once those roles no longer fit, they were replaced by new children, new bodies, new names. And so the cycle continued, unbroken, unacknowledged. By the time Catherine the Great died in the year 1796, the orphan theater had already begun to recede into silence. Her son, Paul I, had little taste for his mother's theatrical indulgences and swiftly dismissed many of her courtiers. The grand salons of Tsarskoye Selo grew quieter. The ornate stage curtains no longer rose for whispered tableau. But the children remained for a time, living in the empty vessel of a system that had lost its purpose, but not its momentum. Polyakova, now in her 50s, was granted a small pension and given quarters near the summer garden. She left behind a final letter, its language clipped and formal, addressed not to a person, but to whomever assumes the archive. In it, she described her own complicity in terms that were neither apologetic nor defiant. She spoke of order, duty, necessity, the words repeated often. Order, refinement, completion. Not once did she use the word child. There is no record of what happened to the last cohort of orphans. Some may have been absorbed into lower roles within the palace staff. Others may have returned to city orphanages, too broken or conditioned to know how to be children again. A few likely disappeared entirely, vanished into the interstices of Russian society where no questions were asked about silent girls with perfect posture or boys who flinched at praise. The structure itself, the physical building of the pleasure theater, underwent renovations in the early 19th century. Portraits were removed, mirrors replaced, decorative panels painted over. But beneath the floorboards, workers found initials carved into the wood, small and precise. Names no longer matched to faces. Lika, MS, Petro, Zoya. A date, a fragment of a song, a crude drawing of a bird with its wings clipped. These markings were undocumented in the renovation ledger. The workers were instructed not to mention them. Some artifacts remain, though few were recognized for what they were. A pair of slippers so small they could only belong to a pre-adolescent child, sewn with pearls. A faded fabric sash bearing the embroidered phrase pour plaire à la cour, to please the court. These were stored with other theatrical memorabilia, catalogued without context. By the mid-19th century, the entire program had been reduced to rumor. A few imperial historians referenced a generation of lost performers who emerged during Catherine's reign, known for their beauty and obedience, but who left no artistic legacy. One Russian poet of the era, Ivan Kashin, alluded obliquely to them in a verse. Beneath the powder and the bow, no age, no name, no face to show. But by then, the silence was near total. The system had done its work. It had created children who performed their way out of memory. And perhaps that was always the point. They were never supposed to be remembered. That was part of the design. The Orphan Theater was not just a place, it was a mechanism, refined over decades to create beauty that vanished once it had served its purpose. These children were not raised to become citizens, thinkers, or adults. They were not meant to speak in their own voices. They were shaped to be gazed upon and then forgotten. In modern scholarship, their traces are ghosts, footnotes in ledgers, blurred faces in sketches, unnamed figures posed beside noble patrons in pastel scenes. The State Hermitage holds portraits labeled young court performers, anonymous. Their features idealized, their gazes flattened into decorative stillness. Visitors admire the brushwork, the lace, the posture. Few ask who they were. Fewer still wonder where they went, but some questions refuse to stay buried. In the early 2000s, restoration work at Tsarskoye Selo uncovered a concealed storage alcove behind a false panel near the old stage. Inside were several items long assumed lost: a set of costume masks, miniature gloves, a child's journal with only 5 surviving pages. The handwriting was careful but uneven, as if taught by rote. Most entries were simple notations: dates, meals, songs rehearsed. But the final line, scrawled hastily across the bottom corner, read, I remember being someone before this. There is no name, no identity to tie it to. But in those 7 words, the entire weight of the system collapses. Historians today continue to debate Catherine's legacy, her reforms, her contradictions, her genius for power. But rarely do these conversations include the erased. Rarely do they reach beneath the stage to where the real performances happen, in whispered obedience, in the forced stillness of children who were made to carry the burden of a nation's self-image. The Orphan Theater was not the only system of its kind. It was not the worst or even the most hidden, but it is emblematic of a wider truth, that in every era of glory, there are those who are polished into invisibility to maintain the illusion. And those who survive, if they survive, carry the shape of that silence in their bones. Perhaps remembrance is the only justice left. Not in courtrooms, not in policy, but in the act of noticing, of asking, of reading between the records, of speaking for those who could not. So if this story stayed with you, if it unsettled something or opened a space you hadn't considered, share it, tell someone, let us know where you're listening from, because these stories were never meant to echo. But still, somehow they do. And yet, if they were erased so completely, how do we still feel them? Why do certain doors within Tsarskoye Selo still carry the strange hush of withheld memory? Why do some archivists report hearing echoes in rooms that have been acoustically sealed? Why did one modern curator, after cataloging the surviving costume pieces from the Orphan Theater, resign without explanation and refuse to speak of the collection again? These are not questions with answers that appear in official histories. But history, as we know, often survives not through facts, but through feeling, through the presence of something that resists explanation. A small draft where there should be none. A chill at the nape of the neck when entering a room painted in soft rococo pink. What if those children, though unremembered by name, remain with us, not as ghosts, but as absences that warp the architecture around them? What if the spaces built to contain them still carry their shape, like a mold that was never broken? And deeper still, what does it mean that so few protested? That the cruelty was masked so effectively in elegance, and that beauty, always the most potent disguise, became the very instrument of their undoing? What does it say about us now that we still gravitate toward these stories? Not out of voyeurism, but because something in us recognizes the wound, not just the specific suffering of these children, but the machinery itself. The way systems elevate the attractive, silence the powerless, and decorate abuse until it passes as refinement. We like to believe that these things are far behind us, that we would see the signs now, that no court, no government, no cultural institution could possibly repeat the horrors of the Orphan Theater. But systems rarely announce themselves. They do not wear the same costumes twice. And the most dangerous ones are the ones that look most like art. So look again. At the image of the child in the painting, posed but not alive. at the program from a performance with no authors listed, at the official narrative that shines too brightly in one direction and casts too dark a shadow in another. Ask, who is missing here? Who has been posed into stillness? Whose story was smoothed out so completely that we no longer notice the gap? And when we ask these questions, not just of Catherine's court, but of every story dressed in grandeur, we do not just uncover the past. We begin quietly to resist the future they tried to build. In the great gallery of Russian imperial history, Catherine the Great is remembered as a towering intellect, a strategist, a collector of ideas and empires. Her statues stand tall in squares and libraries, Soma and Buns. Her words are engraved in textbooks. Her legacy is celebrated in enlightened policy and the civilizing ambition of her reign. But beneath her triumphs, beneath the portraits and gilded mirrors, there is another architecture. One not built of marble or measured in battles, but shaped in silence. It is the architecture of what was taken. Not just childhoods or names, but time, touch, memory, a voice. All the things a human being needs to know they are alive. The Orphan Theater did not collapse with revolution. It faded with grace. Its costumes folded and stored. Its performers absorbed or discarded, its records misfiled or burned. And like many things born of power and shame, it disappeared not with an explosion, but with applause. And yet the traces remain, in floorboards marked by bare feet, in unmarked graves beneath overgrown hedgerows, in the wordless knowledge passed between children who learned too early that survival is performance and that obedience is the currency of safety. These children were not saints. They did not escape to write memoirs. They did not lead revolts. They did not even die publicly. They were folded into history like paper into fire, small, weightless, and vanishing. But they were real. So perhaps the question is not whether we remember them, but whether we're still building stages like theirs, where suffering is veiled in aesthetics, where compliance is rewarded, and where the most vulnerable are reshaped to reflect someone else's desire. Maybe we still applaud those performances. Maybe we still don't look behind the curtain. And maybe the most honest act of remembrance is not to mourn them as victims of a distant empire, but to recognize the systems that never fully vanished. To ask, even now, where the orphans are kept, what scripts they're being forced to follow, whose gaze defines their worth, whose silence protects their captors. Because history does not end, it only waits. And the stage is still set.